President Trump in recent weeks has been on a crusade against critical race theory. I believe this is possibly the most important thing he's done with his presidency. Even if he hadn't taken any active steps against it, to simply shine light on it, to make people aware of it, and to, as the leftists would say, problematize it, I guess is the phrase, that is an enormous public service. But Trump has gone further than that. He's, and here's the latest. He tweeted this last night. He said, "A few weeks ago, I banned efforts to indoctrinate government employees with divisive and harmful sex and race-based ideologies. Today, I've expanded that ban to people and companies that do business with our country, the United States military, government contractors, and grantees. Americans should be taught to take pride in our great country, and if you don't, there's nothing in it for you." So that's a very good thing. Critical race theory is a scourge. It is an ideological cancer. It has infected our societal bloodstream, and the effects have been devastating. The racial strife in our country today, riots, much of the violence, this can all be traced, at least in part, back to critical race theory. Now, I think before we go any beyond that, though, I think we probably first have to answer a basic question, which is, what is critical race theory? And for that, so that you know I'm not giving you a biased or cherry-picked definition, I will go to a liberal source. I'll go to the Boston Globe article that was just written, which is meant to be a defense of critical race theory, henceforth referred to as CRT, by the way, just for short, and also dismantlingracism.org, which is an online resource that's supposed to help you, well, dismantle racism, though, as we'll see, probably constructing racism or spreading racism would be a better name for that website. First, here's the Boston Globe article. It says, "Scholars say the president's remarks about CRT prove he fundamentally misunderstands critical race theory and its aims. I am 1,000% sure that Trump does not know what critical race theory is. I have never been more sure of anything in my life," said Kiara Bridges, professor at the University of California, Berkeley Law School, and author of the textbook Critical Race Theory, A Primer. She goes on, "And he certainly doesn't understand the debates within and about critical race theory. Scholarship on critical race theory emerged in the 1970s and 80s in response to what legal scholars perceived to be the failures of traditional approaches to thinking about race and civil rights, which tended to conceptualize racism very narrowly," according to Bridges, "as a problem of individual bad actors. The movement's architects, including the late Derek Bell, the first tenured black professor at Harvard Law School, and Kimberly Crenshaw, a professor at the UCLA School of Law and Columbia Law School, who first coined the term critical race theory, says racism is not extraordinary." She continued, "Race and racism are basically baked into everything we do in our society. It's embedded in our institutions. It's embedded in our minds and our hearts." Then it goes on, "Despite the progress and promises of the civil rights movement, critical race theorists argue that racism infects all of our societal institutions, from public education to the criminal justice system. What appears to be progress in the law is actually concealing a new modality of structural societal systemic racism. That, according to Rajesh Sampath, an associate professor of philosophy of justice, rights, and social change at Brandeis University. Namely, our laws and constitutions don't protect everyone equally," he said. Okay, so that's the Boston Globe. Racism is embedded in everything we do. America is racist down to its very core. White Americans are racist in their hearts, in their minds. Everything is racist. Racism is everywhere. And even when it looks like racism is being addressed by laws and policies, really those laws, like constitutional provisions guaranteeing equal rights, for example, they are just creating, quote, new modalities for racism. So then we go over to dismantlingracism.org, which says, here's what it says: "Racism is ordinary, the normal way that society does business, the common everyday experience of most people of color in this country. Racism serves the interests of both white people in power, the elites materially, and working class white people physically, and therefore neither group has much incentive to fight it." Later on it says, "White supremacy is ever present in our institutional and cultural assumptions that assign values, morality, goodness, and humanity to the white group while casting people of communities of color as worthless, immoral, bad and inhuman, and undeserving." And then it defines racism as racism equals race prejudice and social and institutional power. Racism equals a white supremacy system. All right, so what does all this mean? It means that everything is racist again. Racism is everywhere. America is a white supremacist country. But also importantly, racism is a uniquely white phenomenon. Only white people can be racist. Racism equals a white supremacy system. Now, there are a few problems here, of course. First of all, this obviously is nonsensical. It doesn't even take into account the existence of the whole rest of the world. Even if I agreed that in this country, black people can't be racist because whites against whites because whites have all the power, which I most emphatically do not agree with that. But even if I did, what about, say, China or India? There's a lot of racism in India. Racism between and towards non-white people. Racism directed from one non-white group to another non-white group. What about, for example, a person in India who hates black Africans? And that is not an unheard of phenomenon, I can tell you, to put it mildly. By this definition of racism, that's not racist. This definition of racism has no way to account for that. So you see here this weird dynamic where critical race theorists, while hating white people, also in a strange way, put white people on a pedestal, or at least at the center stage of the world play. When talking about things like racism or slavery, for that matter, they pretend that nobody else exists and that everything revolves around white people. And so somehow white people are responsible for things that have existed in human civilization literally since its inception. Feminists do a very similar thing with men, by the way, hating men, but yet also centering their whole lives and worldviews around men. So this is a common theme on the left. But okay, going along with the CRT camp and pretending for a moment that India doesn't exist and China doesn't exist, two countries that are rife with racism, but pretending they don't exist. What about here? Is it true that in this country only whites can be racist because whites have all the institutional power? No. That's a false conclusion built on a false premise. And it's so faulty and so stupid that even if the false premise was true, the conclusion still would be false because it doesn't follow from it. It's not true that whites have all the institutional power. That is observationally false. You can look around for yourself and see that not all institutions are run by white people, nor are all institutions dedicated to the advancement of white people. There are a lot more white people in positions of power than black, yes, in terms of raw numbers, but that's because there are a lot more white people, period. Black people are 13% of the population. A minority of the population is also going to be a minority of most institutions at all levels. That's just a mathematical inevitability. But even so, whites don't have all the institutional power. We did have a black president, after all. And though the left scoffs at that response to the America is racist charge, scoffing is not an argument. It is an absence of an argument. You can laugh and roll your eyes all you want. The fact is that you cannot say black people don't have institutional power when the most powerful man in the country for the 8 of the last 12 years was a black man. That claim makes no sense. It is incoherent. What about laws? Are laws constructed to advance white people? No. In fact, the opposite. There are no laws, period, at all, that explicitly favor white people. No laws in this country at all. There are laws that explicitly disfavor white people, affirmative action and related policies. Okay? You cannot provide an example of an affirmative action type thing that explicitly favors whites because it doesn't exist. It does exist on the reverse. So all of that is wrong. But the fact that facts don't support critical race theory and actually contradict it every step of the way is irrelevant, of course. CRT is a religious system. It is a dogma. When you read a supposedly scholarly explanation of CRT, what you're really reading is a catechism. The idea that racism lies at the root of all things, invisible and undetected, and that racism itself is some sort of strange and mysterious way, is a white invention or a tool wielded by Western white civilization, even though racism existed in humanity before Western white civilization even existed itself, and certainly before it had power like it does today. These ideas cannot be factually proven or supported, and that's by design. They are statements of faith, not fact. And those who teach CRT, or rather proselytize it, are not looking to convince you on an intellectual level. They're looking for your spiritual and emotional assent. And if they can't have that, then your cowed submission will have to do. And that is why Trump, I think should expand his war against this poisonous religious ideology beyond federal contractors and into schools, where it really starts. And where it's the most dangerous. It should be banned from public schools. It should be banned on the basis that it infringes on the First Amendment. If teachers cannot get up in front of the class and insist that their students accept Jesus Christ as their Lord and Savior, then they shouldn't be able to get up and insist that their students accept critical race theory dogmas either. These are both religious doctrines. The fact that, in my view, one is true and one is not is irrelevant. I don't want public schools demanding fealty to religious dogmas, even Christian dogmas. So I think it should be banned from public schools, ban it from public universities, impose financial penalties on any public education institution that promotes it. Personally, I think teachers who use their power and influence to brainwash children into this horrid superstition deserve to go to jail. But fines and defunding would suffice for now, I guess. If people want to, go out on their own and explore critical race theory and pledge their devotion to its tenets, they're free to do that. But our public institutions should not be in the business of promoting it. Which, by the way, the fact that our public institutions do promote critical race theory is, ironically, proof in itself that critical race theory is false. But I don't expect its proponents to connect those dots, because one thing we've learned about critical race theory is that it certainly doesn't involve any critical thinking. Hey, you right there. Hit the subscribe button right now. Do it right now. I thank you for your compliance. It's somewhat appreciated.